He left her for a rich woman. Years later, God made her the one he needed most. He left when the town smelled like rain and second chances. April watched taillights fade down County Road 12 and told herself she would not chase what chose to leave. George chose wealth, noise, and a life that photographed well. The ring he'd promised stayed in her drawer, between old church bulletins and a letter she never mailed. Years passed the way small towns do, slow, honest, keeping score in casseroles and whispered prayers. April learned to stay, through early morning shifts at the community cafe, through evening bookkeeping at her aunt's flower shop, through Saturday volunteer hours at the church pantry. She chose presence over performance, roots over applause. George learned that not all gold is glory. Deals collapsed. Friends vanished. Love that was dazzled by chandeliers dimmed in the plain light of ordinary days. Then his father's health failed. The family hardware store bled money. And one name kept returning in every conversation. April, reliable, steady, trusted by everyone he wasn't anymore. He came back to Maple Ridge with a suitcase and a silence he didn't know how to carry. He didn't return for romance. He returned because the town said he needed help, and help had a face. He once left April for a rich woman. Now God was writing a quieter miracle, making April the person George needed most, because grace rebuilds what pride breaks. If you've ever been overlooked, abandoned, or replaced, stay. This story is for the ones who chose character when someone else chose convenience. Keep watching, because somewhere between unpaid invoices, late-night inventory, and a hospital room that smells like antiseptic and mercy, God will turn a wound into a doorway. And when that doorway opens, you'll see it. Not fireworks, not headlines, just two people learning how to tell the truth. One small, faithful choice at a time. Stay to the end to witness the moment that changes everything, and the quiet prayer that makes it possible. The cafe had the soft hush of dishes and distant rain. April wiped a crescent of steam from the window with her sleeve. Main Street glittered with puddles that remembered thunder. The chalkboard read, "Pay it forward coffee, $2. She checked the tip jar, half coins, half folded prayers. Behind the counter waited a small wooden drawer, familiar as breath. She told herself she wasn't going to open it tonight. She opened it anyway, the way some people check the weather. Inside lay a ring box and a letter the color of old cream. The letter had softened at its folds like a confession. She had written it after he left, then never mailed it. Not because the words were wrong, but because they were true. Truth can bruise when sent to the wrong address. She traced the edge of the paper and let it rest. Outside, a truck hissed by and flung silver water. Chimes on the door gave a tired little warning. Mrs. Lang from the bakery slid in, shaking her umbrella. "Storm found you?" April asked, offering a towel. "The storm always finds us all, sooner or later." They traded a smile that knew too many stories. Mrs. Lang ordered chamomile and a quiet chair. While the kettle murmured, April saw herself in the glass. Not the teenager who watched taillights on County Road 12. A woman now with work-smudged hands and steady eyes, green eyes that had learned to hold a room together. Hair pinned back with the calm of someone who stays. She measured tea like she handled grief, slow, exact. Steam rose like a small, faithful miracle. The drawer tugged at her attention again. She slid it shut with careful fingers and routine grace. That was how April survived a liturgy of small tasks. Wipe table, refill sugar, sort mugs by chipped and whole. God had met her in the ordinary, and she kept showing up. Not for applause, not for headlines, but for people. For the kind of love that looks like refills and chairs. At closing time, she flipped the sign to "See you tomorrow." The rain thinned to a whispering curtain. Neon bled softly on wet brick and painted door frames. Maple Ridge always exhaled after a storm, like a prayer. She counted the register, logged the day's simple math. Coins clinked into neat stacks, faithful as church bells. She did not think about the city or its chandeliers, but memory does not ask for permission to visit. It arrived with the smell of cologne and elevator lobbies. George laughing too loudly at rooftop parties she never attended. A phone call with echo, a promise that felt rehearsed. "Don't wait up," his last text under a glittering skyline. Goodbyes don't always come with periods, only ellipses. Hers had stretched into years, then hardened into quiet. April locked the front door and dimmed the lamps. She swept the floor, a slow metronome of bristle and wood. One sugar packet crackled beneath the broom. She stooped, smiled at herself, and kept sweeping. Being needed had become its own kind of healing. She liked being a place where people landed, even if the person who left never would. In the back room, the radio played a hymn softly. A volunteer had left it tuned to the church station. "Great is thy faithfulness," a voice hummed through static. April didn't sing, but her hands did the remembering. She wiped the counter in gentle circles and amen. Faithfulness had meant staying sober on ordinary days. It had meant learning not to rehearse old scenes. On the shelf above the ledger sat a Polaroid. Her aunt, decades younger, grinning in the flower shop, sunflowers around her like a crown of ordinary gold. April had started helping with the books on weeknights. Numbers were an honest company. They didn't perform. They asked only to be seen and set in order. She liked that. She liked that very much. Her phone buzzed, a text from Pastor Leah. "Pantry shelves low after storm. Can you open early?" April answered yes before the second vibration finished. Serving had stopped being a choice. It was a rhythm that made space where ache used to live. She set 2 alarms and a note for extra loaf donations. Mercy often begins as a list. She turned off the radio and listened to the building breathe. Pipes clicked. Wood settled. Rain stitched the gutters. Her own heart kept decent time in her chest. "Okay," she whispered to the quiet that had held her. "Okay, we're done for tonight." She reached for the light, but hesitated. The drawer again in the corner of her eye. She could have left it closed and walked away. But closure is a door you usually open yourself. She slid the drawer out and lifted the letter. The first line still stung with its clean honesty. "I loved you without the lights, and you left me for the lights." She folded it back, proud she'd once said something true. Truth, even unread, can set a soul in order. Footsteps passed outside on the wet sidewalk. 2 teenagers laughed, a dog shook rain into sparks. Life kept being life without asking permission. April tucked the letter beneath the ring box. She let her fingers rest on both a moment longer, not to worship what was gone, but to bless its lesson. Then the drawer closed with a quiet wooden click. She carried the trash to the back alley. The rain had loosened to mist that kissed her hair. Somewhere a train moaned, long and far, like a memory. She waited under the shallow awning and watched it pass. The town felt held together by crepe myrtles and stubborn hope. She smiled at her own poetic nonsense and rolled her eyes. Then she went back inside to finish the night. On the corkboard by the time clock, a flyer hung crooked. Hardware store help needed, experience preferred. In smaller print, Lancaster & Son, apply in person. April straightened it just because she straightens things. She didn't notice the date in the corner, printed fresh. She didn't see the number scrawled on the tear-off tabs. She only noticed her own instinct to make order again. When she finally stepped into the street, the air tasted new. Petrichor and coffee tangled like a kindly spell. Maple Ridge's stoplights blinked their patient red-yellow. Wind chimes clinked at Mrs. Lang's dark window. A single star needled through the departing clouds. "Good night," April told the town like an old friend. The town answered with a hush that understood. Home was a second-floor walk up above the barber. Stairs creaked with the forgiving sound of old wood. She toed off her shoes and hung her sweater to dry. The room wore thrift store charm and reliable comfort. A plant in the window leaned toward streetlight. Her aunt had left a bouquet of leftover daisies on the table. Yellow faces that refused to be anything but alive. April showered the day's steam and sugar from her skin. She braided her hair with the economy of habit. Tea steamed in a chipped mug printed with lilies. She sat, pulled the ledger close, and toggled to her aunt's books. Columns waited, gaps asking to be mended. She reconciled a week in 7 minutes and exhaled. Numbers again saying thank you by adding up. Her phone lit with a news alert she ignored. Then another, businessman George Lancaster. She swiped away. That last name belonged to half a town's mailboxes. Lancaster & Son had repaired everyone's furnace in winter. She thought of the flyer she had straightened without seeing. Coincidences in small towns weren't coincidences at all. They were echoes looking for their source. She stretched, turned off the lamp, and left the window cracked. Rain thinned to a drip that counted seconds into peace. Down the street, a siren wailed and then reconsidered. April slid under quilts that smelled like clean cotton and lemon. The unsent letter refused to haunt her tonight. She had filed it the way you file weather. Acknowledged, survived. Sleep found her with open hands. In another part of town, a car engine cooled. A suitcase thumped onto a porch that remembered teenage sneakers. A key scraped a lock that hadn't hurt him in years. The living room sighed dust and old photographs awake. A phone on low battery blinked with unanswered messages. George stood very still in a house full of before. Somewhere in the house, his father coughed and called his name. April dreamed of highways that circled back to Main Street, of doorbells that sounded like second chances, of a drawer that held history without hurting. Morning arrived in the dream as a bell above a café door. She woke before it rang, certain she had forgotten something. She poured the certainty into a to-do list for the pantry. Sometimes miracle looks exactly like preparation. Dawn bled into the blinds as a soft confession. April laced her shoes and tied her apron in the kitchen. She laughed at herself for dressing this early at home. Old habits put on their coats before the alarm. She shrugged, grabbed her keys, and kissed the daisies. "See you tonight, brave faces," she told them. The petals looked like they believed her. On the stoop, the world smelled like starting over. Trucks hummed, sparrows edited the last of the storm. April locked the door and took the stairs two at a time. Her reflection winked in the barber's darkened mirror. She waved to no one and to everyone simultaneously. Small towns make you friendly to the unseen. She turned toward the cafe as the first bus sighed by. The bus windows flashed a dozen ordinary lives. A nurse rubbing sleep from one eye with a knuckle. A boy hugging a trumpet case like a secret. A man in a dark jacket studying his hands. April felt that familiar tug to pray without words. Keep them, her heart said to a God who listened. She didn't notice the jacketed man look back at her. She unlocked the cafe and snapped on the first light. Warmth pushed the night to the edges of the room. She breathed once deep and reached for the drawer. Not to dwell, but to prove she wasn't afraid of it. The letter stayed where it belonged, filed, honored, quiet. She closed the drawer and smiled at the ordinary courage. Then the bell over the door rang for the very first time today. The morning broke soft and unsure, the kind that doesn't promise much. April unlocked the cafe and turned on the first light, watching it spread across the counter like a sunrise rehearsing hope. Steam rose from the first pot of coffee, swirling with the ghost of every early prayer whispered there. She thought about the letter again, how it never traveled, how maybe it wasn't meant to. Some words were meant to stay in drawers until hearts healed enough to read them without bleeding. Her peace was steady now, but not unshakable. And that's when the phone rang. The landline almost never rang that early. She dried her hands and picked it up, half expecting Pastor Leah's voice. Instead, it was deeper, familiar but worn by years. "April?" The single word sounded like a memory calling collect. "This is George." "Lancaster." Silence stretched like a bridge between two cliffs. She gripped the counter, her voice calm but cautious. "George, hi." He swallowed hard. "I wouldn't bother you, but my dad's sick. The doctors say it's bad." April's pulse stuttered, old compassion waking faster than her defenses. "Mr. Lancaster?" she asked softly. "He used to fix our coffee grinder for free." "Yeah, he still talks about that." His voice cracked on the word still. He cleared his throat. "I'm back in town for a while, trying to keep the hardware store open." April glanced toward the flyer she'd straightened the night before. The same one she hadn't realized was his. "That sounds hard," she said after a pause that felt like years. "Yeah," he exhaled, laughter with no humor. "Hard is one word. I'm hiring," he added. "Just part-time. Office stuff. You're good with numbers, right?" Her laugh came out smaller than she meant. "I've been called worse." "Please, April," he said, voice low, edges breaking. "I could really use someone I can trust." The sentence wasn't about accounting, and both of them knew it. She promised to think about it, though her heart already answered. Because when God brings someone back, sometimes it's not to reopen a wound, it's to prove it healed. After hanging up, April stared at the receiver, pulse tangled between memory and mercy. The drawer seemed to hum behind her, holding its unsent testimony. She whispered to herself, "This time if I open it, it'll be for the right reasons." Then she clocked out early and walked toward the church pantry. At the pantry, cardboard boxes towered like miniature cities. She unpacked donations, bread, peanut butter, hope in cans. Pastor Leah noticed the faraway look on April's face. "Old ghosts?" she asked, half teasing, half prophetic. April smiled faintly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just rain that never quite dries." "You know," Leah said, "sometimes God sends us back where we were hurt. Not to stay broken, but to prove we've changed. April nodded, but her heart wasn't ready to agree out loud. When she left the pantry, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. Main Street gleamed like a page freshly turned. She stopped by the flower shop, clipped a bouquet for Mr. Lancaster. Daisies, because forgiveness shouldn't wear expensive petals. Her aunt raised a brow but said nothing. Wisdom often travels in silence. With flowers in one hand and courage in the other, April crossed the street. The hardware store doorbell jingled like a memory waking up. The store smelled like sawdust and time. Tools hung on walls that remembered busier days. The counter was half buried in invoices, just like the flyer promised. And there he was, George. Older, thinner, but undeniably him. The same eyes that once looked past her now lifted slowly, unsure if they were allowed to meet hers. "Hey," he said. "You came." "I said I'd think about it," she replied, chin slightly raised. Her calm disarmed him. She wasn't the same girl he left. He tried to smile. "Still keeping your promises, huh?" She shrugged. "Only the ones that matter." They both laughed awkwardly, then quiet fell between them like fog. In that silence, humility did what pride never could. It made room for grace. George gestured toward the back office. "It's a mess, but maybe you can make sense of it." April followed, noticing his limp, a slight favor in his left leg. He caught her glance and smiled faintly. "Long story. I've got time," she said gently. He hesitated. "Not sure I deserve that." She looked him in the eye. "Maybe it's not about deserve." Then she walked past him into the room where old debts and new beginnings would meet. The office looked like it hadn't seen daylight or hope in years. Papers sprawled like confessions, ledgers smudged with coffee stains. A photo on the wall showed his family, back when smiles were easier. April set the daisies beside the photo. "Your dad will like these," she said quietly. George leaned on the desk, hands trembling slightly. "He'll like that you brought them." She booted up the old computer. The screen flickered alive reluctantly. "Username?" she asked. He grinned nervously. "Try Lancaster Legacy." I didn't pick it. The word legacy stung like irony, but she typed it anyway, steady fingers typing where her heart shook. When the login worked, George laughed under his breath. "Guess it still knows who we are." "Let's hope we still do," she murmured. For a moment their eyes met. Not past or future, just the present. Two people who had broken each other once, now quietly rebuilding a spreadsheet. He watched her work, the way she bit her lip in concentration, the same way she used to read poetry at youth nights. He remembered thinking she was too small town, too content, too faithful. Now, watching her move through the wreckage with grace, he realized that faithfulness had outlasted his ambition. And he felt something shift inside him, something old loosening its grip. As she worked, April asked simple questions about stock counts and vendors. He answered, his voice finding rhythm again, human again. At one point, she asked, "Do you ever miss the city?" He paused, really thinking. "Sometimes, but not the man I was there." April smiled faintly. Then maybe the leaving worked. He looked at her, really looked, and nodded. Maybe it did. Outside, a bell tolled from the church on Main Street. Later, as the sun slipped behind the grain silos, April gathered her things. "I'll come back tomorrow," she said. "There's more work than one day can fix." George walked her to the door, his shadow longer than his pride. "Thank you for even showing up." April met his eyes. "Everyone needs help sometime. You taught me that, just not the way you planned." He smiled, but regret still weighed the corners of it. And then, quietly, he said, "I'm sorry." April froze for a second. It wasn't dramatic, it was honest, unpolished, almost whispered. She didn't answer right away. The moment didn't need words. Forgiveness isn't an announcement, it's a decision made one heartbeat at a time. "Good night, George," she said instead. Then she stepped into the amber dusk, the bell above the door chiming behind her like a benediction, and he watched her go, realizing she carried peace he couldn't buy. When she reached the corner, she turned once, just enough to meet his gaze again. Not to reopen the past, but to confirm it was behind them. For now, because some stories don't end, they circle, waiting for courage to finish what pain interrupted. The next chapter of theirs had just begun, and both of them could feel it. He exhaled a prayer he hadn't prayed in years, and upstairs his father's faint voice called for him again. That night, April couldn't sleep. Not because of regret, but because of possibility. She lay in the dark, thinking of how God rewrites stories, not with lightning but with timing. How the same road that once carried heartbreak can bring healing home. The drawer waited quietly in the cafe, letter untouched but no longer haunting. In her heart, something new stirred, unpredictable, unfinished, alive. And she whispered to the ceiling, "If this is you, I'll stay for the whole story." The streetlights of Maple Ridge flickered against the glass windows, their glow spilling across the dusty shelves of Lancaster and Son. The store had closed hours ago, but the hum of the old refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock kept the night alive. George sat behind the counter, elbows on the table, surrounded by ledgers, bolts, and the scent of oil and rain. The quiet wasn't peace, it was consequence. He rubbed his forehead, realizing how much silence demanded honesty, and in silence, April's voice still echoed. Steady, kind, unafraid. He hadn't expected her to come back. Not after what he'd done, not after the years and the headlines, but she had walked through that door like grace itself. Soft, human, undeserved. Her laughter had shaken the dust off his guilt more effectively than any apology could. He glanced at the daisies she'd left beside his father's photo. They were already wilting, but somehow still beautiful. Maybe Grace was like that too, fragile but refusing to die. In the back room, the light under the door flickered. His father couldn't sleep. "George?" came the hoarse voice. "Is that you, son?" "Yeah, Dad, go back to bed. I'll finish the reports." The old man coughed, the kind that made time sound expensive. "I saw her today," he rasped. "April." George froze, unsure how his father knew. "She came by?" "I may be half blind, but I know that voice," the old man chuckled softly. "She's still the one who brought flowers to your mother's grave when you were too busy closing deals." George closed his eyes, remembering that day in bitter detail. The funeral, the photographers he didn't send away, the woman beside him whose jewelry sparkled louder than her condolences. He had told himself he was building a future, but in truth he had only been running from himself. "Maybe God sent her back," his father murmured, half asleep already. George whispered, "Or maybe he sent me back to apologize." He stayed long after midnight, flipping through old invoices. Each one told the same story, something broken, someone trying to fix it. It made him think about how much fixing cost and how much pride had cost him more. The desk lamp hummed softly as he reached for a pen. He wrote her name in the corner of a page, then scratched it out. Still, the ink left a shadow. Shadows, he thought, always tell the truth about light. The next morning, April arrived before sunrise. The door chime startled him awake, coffee cup half empty beside his hand. "Early start," she said, eyebrows lifted in amused surprise. He rubbed his eyes. "Didn't sleep." "Then at least drink something that isn't guilt," she teased, placing a thermos on the counter. He blinked at her, black coffee, just how he used to take it. "Still remember my order?" "Some things don't change," she replied softly. "Some should," he said, voice roughened by regret. The air between them was thick with memories of laughter, of promises, of unspoken wounds. She sat across from him, pulling out files like armor. "We'll start with the vendor debts," she said briskly. He smiled faintly, grateful for her professionalism. It gave him room to breathe, and maybe slowly to heal. As they worked, the light through the window changed from gold to white. The town came alive outside. Truck engines, barking dogs, a bell from the bakery. Inside, everything felt suspended between past and present. April flipped a page and found an old receipt signed in her handwriting. "Remember this?" she asked. "I helped you once when your dad was in the hospital." George stared at the paper, voice catching. "Yeah, I remember not saying thank you." "Then you're lucky I'm patient," she said, half smiling. The day passed in slow, rhythmic motion. She typed numbers. He fixed shelves. Sometimes they spoke about invoices. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. But silence was no longer hostile. It was gentle, almost sacred. Every so often, he'd glance up and see her humming to the radio. It wasn't a song he knew, but it sounded like forgiveness. He didn't dare interrupt it. At lunchtime, she packed sandwiches she'd brought from the cafe. He protested, but she waved him off. "You've forgotten how to eat real food," he chuckled. "Guilty." She handed him the sandwich and said quietly, "Guilt isn't a meal, George." He looked down, then laughed despite himself. You always were the preacher's favorite." "Maybe because I actually listened," she said, and they both smiled. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a prison. It felt like soil being turned for new seeds. As the afternoon waned, thunder rumbled far off. The scent of rain pushed through the open window. George walked to the door and leaned against the frame, watching gray clouds roll in. "You ever wonder," he said, "if we're supposed to find our way back to the same people?" April's hands paused over the keyboard. "Maybe not the same people," she said, "but the same hearts once they've learned to beat differently." He nodded slowly, his throat tightening with something like hope. The storm broke suddenly, rain drumming against tin, lights flickering once. April jumped slightly as the power dimmed. "Don't worry," George said. "The generator's old but loyal, like most of this town." He fetched a lantern from the back and set it between them. Its glow softened their faces, shadows dancing across the counter. Outside, the world blurred into gray, but inside something glowed steady. The silence returned, but this time it was full. Lightning cracked, followed by the low growl of thunder. April glanced at the window, lost in the rhythm. "You always loved storms," George said. "Said they were God's way of washing the world." She smiled faintly. "Maybe that's still true." He watched her, light flickering across her face. "You think he could wash what I've done?" April turned toward him, steady and unflinching. "He already did. You're just still drying off." The power flicked back on with a soft hum, returning color to everything. George stared at her a moment longer, the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to say thank you, or I missed you, or I'm sorry again, but none of them were enough. Instead, he said, "You'll come back tomorrow?" April smiled, gathering her notes. "If the storm doesn't wash the roads away." And then, as she left, he whispered to the door, "I hope it doesn't." That night, he sat in the same chair long after she was gone. The ledger now balanced, the store quieter, his heart louder. He reached for his phone, scrolling through old photos. His city life, the woman he once chose for her wealth. All glitter, no grace. He deleted them one by one, until only one remained. An old Polaroid of him in April at a church fundraiser. Her eyes had been full of light then, unafraid, unwavering. And for the first time in years, he prayed she'd look at him like that again. Miles away, April stood by her window, watching rain trace paths down the glass. She didn't know why her heart felt heavier tonight. Maybe because she had seen the weight he carried. Forgiveness wasn't weakness. It was witness. And she was learning that sometimes God asks you to sit in someone's storm until they remember the way home. She whispered, "One day at a time," and closed the curtains. Outside, thunder rolled over Maple Ridge like a heartbeat. And somewhere between grace and grief, love stirred. But neither of them dared name it yet. The storm lingered into morning, leaving Maple Ridge wrapped in mist. Puddles mirrored the storefronts like fragile memories trying to stay. April walked fast through the damp air, her umbrella no match for the drizzle. The church bell rang 6 times, echoing against her ribs. She wasn't late for work, but her heart was already running. Something about last night wouldn't leave her alone. Maybe it was his eyes, haunted but searching for light. When she reached the hardware store, George was already there. He stood outside, sweeping water from the entrance, his sleeves rolled high. He looked younger that way, human again, not the ghost of a man she'd known. "Morning," she said softly, adjusting her scarf. "Hey," he answered, brushing wet hair from his forehead. Generator held up fine. "Guess the storm didn't win after all." "Maybe not," she said, "but it tried its best." Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with sawdust. George had brought donuts from the bakery, an olive branch in sugar form. "I wasn't sure what you liked," he said, "so I got everything." April smiled, hiding how her heart softened too easily. "You always did overcompensate," she teased, taking one. He laughed, a real laugh this time, rough but alive. For a moment, it felt almost normal. They worked quietly through the morning. April handled invoices. George reorganized shelves with unnecessary energy. It was easier than talking about what really mattered. But truth has a way of waiting until we stop pretending. At 10:15, the bell over the door jingled and everything shifted. A woman stepped in, heels clicking, perfume sharp against the air. "George," she said smoothly, like she'd never learned to whisper. April froze. The woman was elegance and ice, hair sleek, diamonds louder than sunlight. She didn't belong in Maple Ridge. She belonged to the world George once chased. Clara, he said under his breath, the color draining from his face. I thought you weren't coming. Funny, she replied. You stopped returning calls. I figured I'd fix that. Her gaze landed on April, curious and cutting. And you must be... Help. April's hands clenched around the pen, her heartbeat tapping its own code. George stepped forward quickly. Clara, this is April. She's helping with the business. Oh, Clara said, eyes narrowing in recognition. The April. The tone wrapped the word in condescension and memory. George flinched as though the past had spoken aloud. April straightened her shoulders, refusing to shrink. Nice to meet you, she said calmly. We're just closing some old accounts, Clara smirked. How poetic. You always did love unfinished business. She turned back to George. I came to collect what's mine. Her words sliced through the small-town quiet. George's jaw tightened. You already took it, all of it. She laughed, low and cruel. Not everything. You still owe me half the investment. April looked between them, piecing together the unspoken story. This wasn't just a reunion, it was reckoning. Clara slid a folded paper onto the counter. Signed agreement. You remember, right? You promised to return once your father's store sold. George's silence was confirmation enough. April's heart sank. She knew debt when she saw it. He'd lost the city, but the city hadn't lost him. It was still coming to collect, dressed in perfume and pride. The storm, it seemed, had only changed its disguise. George, tell me you didn't... April began quietly. I did, he interrupted, voice low. Back then I thought money would fix everything. Clara scoffed. It almost did until you found your conscience. April stared at him, not with anger, but with something worse, understanding. He'd traded love for luxury and still ended up bankrupt in both. Leave the papers, he said. I'll handle it. Clara smiled like a victory. You'll need more than daisies this time. When she finally left, the bell over the door seemed heavier. Rain began again, slow, deliberate, like punctuation. George leaned on the counter, eyes closed, shoulders sinking. April wanted to walk out too, to protect what peace she had left. But she stayed because grace doesn't run from brokenness. Why didn't you tell me? She asked softly. Because I didn't want you to see what you already knew. He sat down hard, voice unraveling. I built everything to prove I was worth something. Then I lost it all trying to keep up. His hands shook as he spoke, the confession raw, almost holy. April took a deep breath, her voice steady but kind. Then maybe this is what's left, what's real. He looked up, eyes glimmering with guilt and hope all at once. You should hate me, he whispered. Everyone else did. April shook her head slowly. I don't hate people who break. I hate when they stop trying to heal. The words landed like prayer. George swallowed, unable to speak. Outside thunder rolled again, softer now, like an echo learning humility. She turned back to the ledger. Pages blurred by quiet tears she didn't hide. Some pain doesn't need hiding, it just needs purpose. And purpose, she knew, was about to test them both. The rest of the day unfolded in hushed fragments. George called the bank. April typed invoices without looking up. They didn't talk about Clara, but she hung in the air like smoke. Around 5, Mr. Lancaster coughed from the back room, calling for water. April went to him, relief written in her every step. The old man smiled weakly. You're still here, she nodded. Some things are worth staying for. When she returned, George was gone. Only the contract sat on the counter, weighted by a wrench. Her stomach tightened. He'd gone after Clara, that much she knew. The rain outside grew heavier, bending branches, smearing reflections. She grabbed her coat and hurried into the storm, heart pounding. The road stretched like memory, familiar and full of regret. And somewhere at the curve near Miller's Bridge, headlights flickered. She saw him there, standing by the railing, soaked, phone pressed to his ear. His voice cracked against the rain, pleading, angry, desperate. I'm not the same man anymore, he shouted. You don't own my peace. April froze, watching the past fight the present in real time. Clara's voice screeched faintly through the phone before he hung up. He threw it into the river without hesitation, breath ragged. Then he turned and saw her. For a long second, neither spoke. Rain fell between them like truth being washed clean. April stepped closer, her voice trembling. You don't have to drown to be forgiven. He blinked hard, the fight leaving his shoulders. I thought I could fix it alone, he said. But I keep breaking everything I touch. She shook her head. Then stop touching what's broken. Start holding what's healing. Lightning flashed behind them, a divine underline to her words. He laughed weakly, half tears, half surrender. You really believe God could still want me after all this? April looked at him, rain shining in her green eyes. I don't just believe it, I've seen it. Every time he let me forgive you. Something in him broke then, but this time it was the kind that makes room for light. He nodded slowly, voice raw. Then maybe this storm isn't punishment. No, she said softly. Maybe it's baptism. They stood there in the rain, two souls washed but not yet dry. No orchestra, no miracles, just the sound of grace breathing. For the first time, George didn't try to be impressive. He just tried to be honest. And April didn't try to be strong. She just stayed. The river beneath them carried the old phone away like confession. And in that fragile silence, redemption began its quiet work. The rain finally stopped by dawn, leaving the world scrubbed and trembling. April woke to the sound of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm has said everything it needed to say. Through her window, sunlight struggled through clouds, gentle and uncertain, like grace testing its wings. She brewed coffee and whispered a prayer that wasn't quite words, just gratitude stitched with exhaustion. George's face kept replaying in her mind, broken, soaked, yet finally honest. There was something sacred about seeing someone stop pretending. She didn't know what would come next, only that something had changed. At the hardware store, the light hit differently that morning. The air felt newer, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. George stood by the door, sweeping again. Habit or redemption, April couldn't tell. He looked up when she entered, eyes clearer than she remembered. Morning, he said, voice low but steady. Morning, she answered, trying to hide the warmth rising in her chest. You left the contract on the counter, she added. I know, he said simply. I tore it up. Her eyes widened. George, that's a lot of money. I've paid too much already, he replied, resting the broom against the wall. There's peace I can't buy back with checks. I'd rather lose the store than my soul. His words weren't rehearsed, they carried the trembling sincerity of a man who meant them. April studied his face and for the first time saw no mask. Just a man learning to stay. They worked side by side again, their movements slower, deliberate. At one point, George reached for a box on a high shelf, wincing as his shoulder caught. You okay? She asked quickly. Just old pain, he said, brushing it off. It's fine. But when he turned away, she saw the truth in his posture. He wasn't fine. The storm hadn't just hit the town, it had hit his body too. Sometimes pain takes longer to drain than rain. Later that day, Mr. Lancaster's cough grew worse. April heard it from the back office and rushed over with water. The old man smiled through the effort, his skin pale as the sheets. You're still here, he wheezed softly. She nodded. Someone has to keep these two in line. His chuckle turned into another cough, but his eyes stayed kind. Thank you for staying, April. You were always the light around here. She squeezed his hand gently, feeling his pulse weak beneath her fingers. When she looked up, George was standing in the doorway, face unreadable. She's good for you, his father said between breaths. Don't lose her again. The words hit harder than thunder ever could. April stood to give them space, retreating toward the front counter. But her heart stayed behind in that room, listening to two men wrestle with regret and love. Sometimes redemption sounds like a dying man's advice. An hour later, George joined her up front, eyes red but resolute. He needs medication we can't afford, he said quietly. Insurance dropped after the hospital transfer. April's heart clenched. How much? More than we've got. But I'll figure it out. She could hear the old instinct in his tone, the self-reliance that once ruined him. Maybe you don't have to do it alone, she said gently. He met her gaze as if hearing that for the first time. That afternoon, she made calls to the church, the town council, even the local paper. She explained the situation not as a plea, but as a story of grace worth finishing. By evening, the community pantry had turned into a small miracle. People brought envelopes, jars, even coins and napkins. Someone donated leftover paint for the store renovation. Pastor Leah dropped by with soup and a smile. See? She told April. Grace isn't a secret. It multiplies when you share it. When George saw the donations stacked by the counter, he froze. Did you? I just told the truth, April said. That you've changed. His eyes glistened, overwhelmed by something unfamiliar. Gratitude. He exhaled, shaking his head. I don't deserve this. She smiled softly. That's what makes it grace. And for the first time, he didn't argue. Night fell like a prayer over Maple Ridge. They worked under lamplight, counting the donations, the air thick with humility. Every coin clink felt like absolution. Mr. Lancaster slept in the back, his breathing even for the first time in days. George paused mid-count and looked at April. "I used to think love was a feeling," he said. "But it's work, isn't it?" She nodded. "The kind that keeps showing up." The next morning, the doctor arrived with good news. The medication had started working. April and George exchanged a look that said more than relief could. He walked his father's hand to rest over his heart, whispering something only heaven would keep. After the doctor left, George lingered in the doorway, watching the man who had once been unshakable now sleeping like a child. He turned to April and said quietly, "He used to tell me light shows up best in broken places." She smiled. "Looks like you're finally seeing it." And in that moment he did, but the peace didn't last long. By noon a letter arrived, official, sealed, and heavy. George's hands trembled as he opened it. The bank was calling the loan. 3 weeks to pay or lose the store. The world he had rebuilt was cracking again, just as he learned to stand. April saw the color drain from his face, fear written in every line. "What does it say?" she whispered. He read it once more before answering. "It says we're running out of time." Her stomach dropped, but her faith didn't. "We'll find a way," she said, voice firm. "We didn't come this far to watch it fall." George wanted to believe her, but doubt shadowed his eyes. "April," he said, "what if this is just punishment delayed?" She shook her head slowly. "Or maybe it's the test before the miracle." The tension lingered like storm clouds that refused to leave. April spent the rest of the day calling old clients, trying to find opportunities. George met with Pastor Leah about potential grants, hope flickering with every maybe. The whole town seemed to lean toward them, rooting for something redemptive. By evening, the golden light through the windows painted everything softer. George stood behind April at the counter, voice low. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," she said gently, eyes still on the ledger. "Just keep going." Her calm steadied him like an anchor in heavy seas. They didn't talk about what could be lost. They focused on what still remained. The store, the town, the quiet between them. It all felt different now. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about stewardship of a second chance. Outside, the sunset spilled over Main Street like a promise kept. Inside, two people who once broke each other started building again. As night deepened, George locked the door and turned off the lights. The hum of the old refrigerator filled the quiet. He looked at April, her face lit faintly by the lamp's last glow. "Thank you," he whispered, meaning everything those two words couldn't carry. April smiled softly. "We're not done yet." And as she stepped out into the cool night, the streetlights flickered on, one by one, revealing what the storm had left behind. Light. The letter from the bank sat like a shadow on the counter. No matter how many times George read it, the words didn't change. 3 weeks. Payment or closure. He had faced bigger storms before, but this one felt personal, because now he actually cared what was at stake. The store wasn't just shelves and nails anymore. It was redemption under a flickering light. It was the place where God had caught him in the act of trying again, and for the first time he didn't want to run. April arrived early the next morning, her hair damp from the fog. She saw the paper still on the counter and didn't need to ask. "Deadline?" she murmured. He nodded, eyes on the floor. "Less than 3 weeks. Then we'll work twice as hard," she said simply. He laughed softly, but it came out broken. "You really believe we can fix this?" "I believe we can be faithful." And that's usually where God starts. They divided the tasks, turning panic into purpose. April called suppliers and renegotiated small debts with grace that disarmed even the toughest voices. George made deliveries himself, greeting customers he hadn't seen in years. The town began to notice Lancaster and Son was changing. Not polished, not perfect, just real again. But every night when he locked up, the silence returned heavier. It whispered, what if this faith isn't enough? One evening, as April counted the day's receipts, George lingered by the window. "Do you ever wonder?" he asked quietly. "If God forgives us before we fix what we've broken?" She looked up, soft but certain. "He forgives us so we can fix it." He nodded slowly, like her words were a language he was still learning. In the distance, the church bell rang 8 times. The sound filled the room with something close to peace. And for a brief moment he believed her. But temptation never knocks politely, it just arrives looking practical. The next day, a man from the city walked in wearing a pressed suit and a rehearsed smile. "Mr. Lancaster," he said, extending his hand. "I represent Ridgeway Holdings. We're interested in buying the store." George frowned. "It's not for sale?" The man chuckled. "Everything's for sale if the price is right." He slid a folder across the counter, numbers that could erase every debt. And maybe erase his second chance too. April entered mid-conversation, sensing the wrongness immediately. "What's this?" she asked, setting her coffee down. The man smiled at her, polite but patronizing. "Business, ma'am." "Actually," she said, "it's his father's business. And this town's." George shot her a look, half warning, half gratitude. The man shrugged. "Suit yourself. Just don't expect charity to pay your bills." Then he left, the bell over the door chiming like mockery. Silence pressed heavy between them after he was gone. April turned to George, voice low. "You're not considering it, are you?" "I don't know," he admitted. "It would solve everything." She shook her head slowly. "It would solve the wrong thing." He rubbed his temples, the war inside him loud and messy. "What if faith doesn't fix this time?" he said, breaking. "Then we'll still be standing," she replied. "Because that's what faith is." That night, George couldn't sleep. He walked through the store in the dark, passing aisles of tools and quiet prayers. The smell of dust and wood carried memories of his childhood, his father's laughter, his mother's hymn humming through the walls. He stopped by the counter where April usually worked and saw her notebook left behind. A verse was scribbled in the margin. "The righteous may fall 7 times, but they rise again." He closed the notebook carefully, like it was holy. Then finally, he knelt by the counter. It wasn't dramatic, no spotlight, no music. Just a man and his failure and a whisper. "God, I don't want to sell what you're trying to redeem." Tears fell quietly, the kind you don't plan. He stayed there for a long time, the floor cold, his heart warm for the first time in years. When he finally stood, the decision was made. He wouldn't sell, even if it meant losing everything else. The next morning, April found him already at work. His sleeves were rolled, his eyes tired but clear. She noticed the suit folder in the trash can and smiled faintly. "You said no, didn't you?" He nodded. "I did." She stepped closer, her voice soft. "Then whatever happens now, we'll face it with clean hands." He looked at her, the gratitude in his silence louder than words. That afternoon, the town showed up again. Customers brought extra orders. Friends stopped by just to check in. Pastor Leah dropped off a donation envelope labeled Faith Fund. The hardware store buzzed with a humble kind of revival. George worked the counter like a man rebuilt from ashes. Every smile he gave was redemption disguised as small talk. April watched him and saw the man she had prayed he'd become years ago. But just when hope felt steady, the phone rang again. It was the doctor. George's expression changed before he spoke. He hung up slowly, the silence breaking like thin glass. "What happened?" April asked, dread rising. He swallowed hard. "It's my dad, he's not responding well anymore." The words fell heavy, impossible to soften. April stepped closer, placing a hand over his. "I'll go with you," she said simply. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, eyes glassy. At the hospital, the hum of machines filled the spaces where words couldn't. Mr. Lancaster looked small beneath the sheets, his breath shallow but peaceful. George sat beside him, holding the same hand that once guided his first hammer strike. "I'm sorry it took me this long," he whispered. April stood behind him, tears blurring the edges of the room. She heard him continue softly. "I thought success would make you proud, but I just wanted forgiveness." The old man stirred, eyelids fluttering. "You were already forgiven," he rasped faintly, eyes half open. George broke completely, bowing his head against the sheets. April placed her hand on his shoulder, steady as prayer. In that sterile, holy quiet, the past finally exhaled. Later, as they drove back through town, the sky glowed with muted amber. Main Street was alive with early evening chatter, lights twinkling in windows. George parked near the store and sat in silence for a long time. April waited, her hand resting near his on the console. "I used to think faith was about getting what you wanted," he said finally. "Now I think it's about trusting what you can't keep." She smiled gently. "That's when it starts to become real." They stood outside the store as the first stars appeared. George unlocked the door, pausing before turning on the light. "Everything looks different," he murmured. April nodded. "That's because you are." He laughed softly, a tear catching in the corner of his eye. "Then maybe this time," he said, "I won't break what he's building." And she answered, "Then let's keep building together." The hospital smelled like antiseptic, and prayers whispered too quietly. George sat beside his father's bed, elbows on his knees, watching the slow rhythm of machines. He hadn't left since dawn, afraid that leaving meant letting go. April arrived with a thermos and soft eyes, her steps slow, reverent. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." The room already carried enough of that. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "He's resting. That's a good sign." But George's silence said what faith sometimes can't. "I'm not ready to lose him." Outside, the town moved on like life always does. Rain gutters dripping, shops opening, bells ringing. Inside, time had folded into a single moment, stretched too thin. Every sound, the monitor, the cough, the shuffle of nurses, felt like a heartbeat counting down. "Did he ever talk about after?" George asked quietly. April shook her head. "Only about before. About how proud he was when you came home." He looked away, blinking back the storm in his eyes. Home had never felt heavier. Days blurred together in fluorescent light. April balanced the store by day and the hospital by night. George barely slept, living between duty and grief. The doctor's words grew quieter each visit, and April learned to read what silence meant. One evening, while George dozed in the chair, Mr. Lancaster's eyes opened faintly. "April," he whispered. "You forgive him, don't you?" Her voice trembled. "Yes, sir." "I already did," the old man smiled weakly. "Then he'll make it." "Make it?" she asked. "Through the storm," he said, eyes closing again. The monitor beeped softly, steady but fragile. April looked at George asleep beside him, head bowed, hand clutching his father's. Sometimes God lets us see how love looks when it's kneeling. She reached out and brushed a hair from George's brow, whispering a prayer that sounded like mercy. That night, George dreamed of his childhood workshop. He was small again, holding nails too big for his hands. His father stood behind him, guiding his grip. "You build by holding steady," the voice said. He woke with tears on his face, heart pounding with a truth he hadn't felt in years. Morning light bled through the blinds, turning sterile white into gold. His father was gone. But peace, unexpected, undeserved, filled the room instead of panic. The funeral was small, honest, full of stories instead of speeches. The whole town came, farmers, church volunteers, old customers. George stood by the casket, April beside him, her hand wrapped gently around his arm. He didn't speak long. "My father built things that lasted," he said simply, "and I broke most of them. But he still loved me. Maybe that's what grace means, when love outlasts failure." The church was silent except for quiet sobs and creaking pews. April squeezed his hand, her tears falling freely. After the service, rain began again, a soft benediction from heaven. They walked down the hill together, umbrellas forgotten. When they reached the truck, George turned to her. "I don't know how to do this without him." "You don't have to," April said. "You just have to keep doing what he taught you, to build by holding steady." He nodded slowly, her words stitching something back together inside him. But faith rebuilt hearts slower than storms broke them. 2 days later, the bank called again. The deadline hadn't changed. April found George sitting on the back steps of the store, head in his hands. "I can't lose this too," he muttered. "Not after him." She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You won't," she said softly. "We'll find another way." But her tone faltered when she saw the unpaid bills scattered beside him. That night, she stayed late at the store, crunching numbers, searching for anything left to save. The light above flickered, buzzing like a tired heart. George stood by the doorway, watching her in silence. "April," he said finally, "you don't have to fix everything." She didn't look up. "Neither do you." He walked closer, leaning against the counter. "I keep thinking God's waiting for me to prove I deserve a second chance." She closed the ledger and met his gaze. "He's waiting for you to believe you already have one." Her words hung in the air like a held breath. George exhaled, stepping closer until only inches separated them. His eyes were tired, but there was something alive there now, something unafraid. "I used to think you stayed because you were stronger," he said. I stayed because I believed God wasn't finished, she answered. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from surrender, not pride. And the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was holy. But the next morning tested every word they'd spoken. A truck skidded outside the store, brakes screeching, glass shattering. April ran out first, heart pounding. The delivery van had crashed into the storefront, wood splintered, tools scattered across the floor. George stood frozen, disbelief written all over him. "Insurance won't cover this," he whispered. The store, his father's legacy, was ruined. April turned to him, voice steady but trembling. "George, look at me." He did, eyes full of despair. "This isn't the end," she said firmly. "This is the moment that will show what faith looks like after it's broken." He shook his head, laughter edged with grief. "Faith doesn't pay for repairs." "No," she said, "but it builds what money can't replace." Her certainty was the only structure still standing, and he leaned into it like it was shelter. That night they stood inside the wrecked store, candles burning on the counter. Rain leaked through the cracked ceiling, dripping into buckets. George looked around the ruined aisles and whispered, "I don't even know where to start." April smiled through tears. "At the beginning, with what's still standing." He followed her gaze, the cross still hanging crooked above the register, untouched by the crash. Light flickered against it, soft but persistent, and in that glow, he remembered his father's words. Light shows up best in broken places. The town showed up again the next morning, as if summoned by prayer. Men brought hammers, women brought paint, children carried nails and snacks. The church bells rang, and laughter echoed through the open door. April organized the repairs like she'd been born to lead revival. George stood beside her, humbled, speechless. "Why are they all here?" he asked quietly. "Because you stayed," she said. "And when someone stays, people notice." For 2 days, the store filled with sawdust and redemption. By Sunday afternoon, the shelves stood straight again. The walls gleamed with new paint. Above the counter, someone had placed a sign hand-painted by the kids, "Rebuilt by Faith." George read it 3 times before tears won. He turned to April, voice breaking. "I don't deserve any of this," she smiled gently. "Grace doesn't ask for permission. It just arrives." And when she said it, he finally believed her. As twilight fell, the church choir rehearsed down the street, voices carrying on the wind. George stood by the doorway, watching light dance across the freshly cleaned windows. He turned to April, expression softer than she'd ever seen. "You saved me," he whispered. She shook her head. "No, George, God did. I just refused to leave before he was done." He took her hand, then carefully, reverently, as if touching something holy. And outside, the sunset burned gold against the glass, like heaven applauding what the world almost lost. The grand reopening of Lancaster and Son looked nothing like a celebration, but somehow it felt holier. No fireworks, no speeches, just the quiet hum of gratitude filling the air. Wood dust still clung to the counter, and the paint smell lingered like proof of resurrection. April adjusted the new sign above the door, hand-painted, imperfect, alive. It read, "Rebuilt by Faith." And for the first time, George believed those words weren't just about the store. The church bells rang softly across Maple Ridge, their echoes brushing against the air. Neighbors wandered in, not to buy but to bless. Every handshake felt like forgiveness. Every smile said, "We saw who you were, but we stayed to see who you became." April moved through the aisles with quiet grace, handing out lemonade and thank yous. George watched her like someone seeing sunlight after years of fog. She was proof that God still used the kind ones to write miracles. When the last visitor left, silence settled like a sigh of peace. The light through the windows turned gold, catching on her hair. April wiped her hands on a rag and leaned against the counter. "Well," she said, "the town didn't fall apart." George smiled. "No, just the parts of me that needed to." He walked closer, every step heavier with meaning, and for once he didn't speak like a man afraid to lose what Grace gave back. "I keep trying to find the right words," he said finally, "but all I can think of is thank you." April tilted her head. "For what?" "For staying. For believing when I didn't. For being what I couldn't." Her eyes softened, tears shining in their green light. "George, you don't owe me gratitude. You owe God your life." He nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "Then maybe he gave it back through you." Outside, the wind carried laughter from the diner across the street. The world kept turning, unaware of the holy ground they stood on. April reached into her apron and pulled out an envelope. It was the same one she'd once kept in that little cafe drawer years ago. The unsent letter, the one that had waited for its right ending. She handed it to him with trembling fingers. "I think it's time you read this." George opened it carefully as if it were scripture. The paper was soft, edges worn with years of patience. He read silently, each line carving light into old scars. "I loved you without chandeliers or applause. And when you left, I thought God did too. But he stayed. And because he stayed, I learned to stay too." When he finished, he couldn't speak. He simply folded it back with reverence. Then he whispered, "You loved me when I didn't deserve it." April smiled faintly. "That's not love, George. That's grace." He laughed softly, a sound half joy, half awe. "And grace stayed," he said, voice breaking. She nodded. "Even when you didn't." He stepped closer, the air between them trembling with everything unspoken. His hand found hers, rough fingers brushing against warmth. "Can I start again?" he asked. "Not as who I was, but as who God's making me." Her tears fell freely then, soft and full of light. "You already started," she said. "The day you came home." The clock ticked quietly in the corner as if heaven were counting the moment. He pulled her into his arms, not desperate, not apologetic, just present. And for the first time, love didn't ache. It healed. It wasn't fireworks. It was shelter. The kind of love that doesn't promise forever. It practices it. Weeks passed and Maple Ridge thrived like a town reborn. The store became more than a business. It was a gathering place again. People came for tools and stayed for prayer. George led a workshop on rebuilding, wood and faith alike. April started a pay-it-forward corner for those who couldn't afford what they needed. The bell over the door became music again, and the cross above the counter never stopped catching the light. One evening, after closing, they sat on the porch steps. The air smelled of cedar and promise. Fireflies blinked across the field, slow as forgiveness. George handed her a mug of tea and said, "You ever think about leaving?" April smiled knowingly. "I used to think leaving was freedom." She turned toward him, eyes gentle. "Now I know staying is." And he nodded, tears glinting like reflections of every miracle she'd made him believe in. Down the street, children's laughter echoed, and the old church bell tolled 9. George leaned back, eyes on the stars just beginning to appear. "You think God ever gets tired of fixing broken people?" he asked. April chuckled. "He doesn't fix, George. He restores." He turned toward her, heart full. "Then I guess I'm proof of that." She smiled. "We both are." And for a long moment, neither spoke, their silence loud with grace. The next Sunday, the church was full. Pastor Leah spoke about rebuilding what storms had taken. Her words found George in the pew, April's hand resting quietly over his. Sometimes, the pastor said, God lets what we built fall apart, not to punish but to prove he can build better. April glanced at him, eyes shining with the kind of faith that doesn't need explanation. He smiled back, whispering, "I believe that now." After the service, the townspeople gathered around them, thanking, hugging, laughing. Someone mentioned the store's new sign. Another offered free paint for the next renovation. Life was simple again, but not small, it was full. Every gesture, every prayer, every sunrise felt like grace repeated. And when they walked home together, hands intertwined, it wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was something better, ordinary faithfulness, the kind that stays after the music fades. That night, the porch light glowed against the dark, warm and steady. George sat on the steps polishing an old hammer that once belonged to his father. April joined him, tucking a blanket around their shoulders. "Still working?" she teased. He smiled, just remembering. He placed the hammer down gently and looked at her. "Thank you for helping me build again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We're both still learning." The night air carried the scent of rain returning, gentle and distant. They sat in silence, watching lightning far off on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he said quietly. She smiled. "Then we'll stay, like we always do." He turned toward her, his voice soft but certain. "Grace that stays." And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like an amen. If this story touched your heart, type "Grace that stays" in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and share this video with someone who needs to believe that God can rebuild what was broken. because sometimes the miracle isn't that he stops the storm, it's that he teaches us how to stand through it. Subscribe for more redeemed heart stories, where faith, love, and grace always find their way home.